The set of readings presented for week 12 revisit some of the earlier theories that we have talked about, and they assess their value for the real world. That is the purpose of Catherine Barbieri's piece that looks at the liberal theory of interdependence and whether or not this decreases the likelihood of going to war with one another or having some kind of militarized dispute. So if you remember the liberal theory, the liberal peace theory is that liberal states will not fight one another, democratic states do not. This is also relevant a little later as we talk about alternative banks. So, if we can extend this logic of whether trade impacts cooperation to financial entanglements, as we talk about development banks and their arrangements, it's important to look at some of the concepts that Barbieri presents related to symmetry and asymmetry between countries. Other scholars have tested whether or not trade ties facilitate peace, and this is an important factor for our theoretical and scientific advancement, but also for practice, for policies that states make. And the empirical evidence on this are mixed, meaning that some authors find that there is a decrease in conflict between countries when there is increasing trade, but other authors like Kenneth Waltz have found that there are that decreasing relationship has as far as trade ties has decreasing impact on war. So this again is the theory of interdependence, and Catherine Barbieri is testing this, looking at militarized interstate disputes between countries, and every country dyad or pairing for every year that she's looking at is considered a data point. Her study looks at the period of between 1870 and 1938. This would mean 14,341 dyad years or data points, and it involved 270 militarized interstate disputes and 14 wars. She includes the pre-World War II period, and this is where her study departs from a lot of other studies that focus on the post-World War II period. There are a lot of arguments for breaking the data point there, but she argues that there needs to be a full historical perspective on this. So the previous research, again, there was little consensus about whether trade extended peace or whether decreasing trade extended peace. But she's saying that there may be a difference between historical periods and different interstate relations, but you have to empirically test that. From the literature on the links between trade and conflict, there are four basic propositions that emerge, and she tests these with her data. The first is that trade promotes peace. The second is that trade might promote peace, but it depends on the nature and context of economic linkages. For example, symmetry, salience, and balance are the important goods that are traded, in other words. And also, there is a reservation about some of the negative consequences of dependence that come from Marxist and neo-Marxist viewpoints. The third proposition is that trade could increase conflict. And the fourth is that trade is irrelevant to conflict. If you are familiar with the quantitative approach and testing hypotheses, this would be our null hypothesis. So more specifically, she hypothesizes that dyads that have salient economic relationships are less likely than other dyads to engage in militarized conflicts. She also hypothesizes that dyads with symmetrical dependence are less likely than others to engage in militarized conflicts. She also says that the presence of both extensive and mutual dependence reduces likelihood of conflict. And finally, that interactive and additive effects of the two dimensions of interdependence, meaning salience and symmetry, reduce the likelihood that dyads engage in interstate conflict. In other words, if countries have symmetrical ties with one another and no one's gaining too much over the other one, in other words, and they also engage and trade in very important goods to one another, then this means that there's a lower likelihood of conflict. So, focusing on militarized disputes between politically relevant dyads, using the unit of analysis of the dyad year, and also getting her data from the Correlates of War project. She looks at the role of interdependence it's as an independent variable on her dependent variable, militarized interstate disputes. So, she measures interdependence by looking at the salience, the size, and importance of trading relationship and symmetry, the equality of dependence between partners. She also measures interdependence by looking at the interaction of these dimensions. So she also uses control variables that might have an impact. Contiguity, meaning are they close to one another, or do they share borders, more specifically proximity, are they regionally close to one another? Do they both have democratic governances? Are they allies? And what are their military powers like compared to one another? She applies 4 logistic regression analysis on using the independent variables salience, symmetry, interdependence, and the additive effects of salience and symmetry as its own combined variable, and she interprets the coefficients. And each independent variable, salient, symmetry, interdependence, and all 3 of these combined into one full model constitute a model, right? And so this is just her table that sort of shows you these variables, and the asterisks represent those that were statistically significant, meaning that there was less than a 95% chance or a 99% chance that the relationships, the correlations were found by chance. And so they do find the importance of salience, symmetry, joint democracy, alliances, and interdependence in this model. So there's little empirical support for this liberal proposition that trade is the path to interstate peace. There's some evidence that trade fails to deter conflict, especially where extensive economic interdependence is present. Symmetrical relationships may be less likely to engage in militarized interstate dispute, but in the case of expanded interstate linkages, this may pose a hindrance to peace through trade because of the high stakes that are involved. Why does this vary or differ from previous findings about trade promoting peace? Barbieri says that a lot of current studies around the time that she's writing are only looking at the period after World War II, and her inclusion of that makes this sort of more meaningful and richer. As I mentioned, the question of symmetry is important even if we're looking at non-trade relationships between countries that signify interdependence. For example, lending and other types of financial transactions between countries. And so this working paper is just kind of an exploration of some of those possibilities when it comes to financial institutions that lend money for development purposes. You should be familiar with other international financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund from our previous references to them. But in 2014, 2 new investment banks for developing countries were created. One was created by the BRICS nations, the New Development Bank, and the other was created by a conglomeration of mainly Asian countries and is called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And the question is whether or not these actually can present viable alternatives to what they call the Bretton Woods system. And some argue that, well, this author actually is arguing that the Millennial Development Bank organizational model, this is something that sort of evolves out of the Millennial Development Goals and kind of structures World Bank and IMF approaches to developing loans in these poor countries. And they're saying that they may fall victim really to the same sort of logic and some of the constraints that the World Bank and IMF do. However, they still are likely to become highly functioning development banks, but whether they will offer real alternatives and policy to the countries that borrow from them is is really something to be seen. The authors wonder whether or not the way the NDB was formed, by giving everyone an equal share instead of weighting them based on their capacity to pay, and therefore giving some countries more power in decision making over policies and loans and things like that. It's questionable. They wonder if it's going to really give them as much power as they need to grow and advance. It's going to really keep them limited in the amount of funds they have. Whereas China itself has an economy that's equal to the entire NDB capital. So this already gives the AIIB a little bit more of an advantage. Either way, both of these are likely to be anywhere from 45 to $90 billion in their overall value, with the Asian Infrastructure Bank obviously being the more plentiful one. Another issue relates to the amount of power that each country in the NDP retain. So even if other members join into this organization, they won't have as much power as the original members. And this makes it feel, again, a lot like the Bretton Woods system, where the rich countries that originally founded these institutions have this institutional power that maybe outweighs their actual weight in the world economy today. On the other hand, the AIIB tends to be a lot more multilateral. Instead of allowing for that concentration of power, they've actually lobbied other countries to join. There are almost 40 joined as of 2015, and they are all allowed to weigh in on statutes, and they are to share governance with other countries. Another advantage is that the Asian Infrastructure Bank has a mixture of industrialized and industrializing countries, so they have the ability to benefit, but also without really becoming overly burdened by poor economies. And this also gives them capital market standing and strong standing as their own potential trading bloc. And this is, really overall seen as making this a more desirable international financial institution. So I think it's important to look at some of these nuances in these trade ties, but also other financial entanglements between countries, to get a fuller idea of what development might look like in the future, as well as this question of conflict.